All right, so it is wanting to respect your time and wanting to make sure that we get through all of the content. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. My name is MK Anderson. I'm the coordinator of the Iowa Clean Cities Coalition. Welcome to the Iowa Volkswagen Settlement Funding Opportunity and Getting Ready for Alternative Fuels webinar. The webinar today is brought to you by Iowa Clean Cities, Iowa Department of Transportation, and the National Renewable Energy Lab. Just a few housekeeping things while we get started. You are all muted on my end, but just in case, please make sure to also mute your line so we don't have any background noise or hear any of your secrets. Since you will all be muted, if you have a question, please type it into the chat box and I will ask them during the Q&A. The webinar today will be recorded and sent to all attendees as well as posted on IEDA's website. As mentioned earlier, we are a little crunched for time. As the moderator, I will be keeping time and I will cut speakers off if necessary. So let's get started. To give you a little bit of an overview of how this webinar will flow, we will start with the introduction to Iowa Clean Cities and the resource we have made to help guide fleets through adding alternative fuels into your vehicle portfolio. Then Stu Anderson and Zach Bidding will go over the Volkswagen settlement and the application for the first round of Iowa's VW settlement funding. We will then take about 10 minutes for Q&As. And then we will transition to learning about best practices for alternative fuel transportation projects with Kay Kelly and Jonathan Gonzalez, followed by another 10-minute Q&A. There are a lot of you on this webinar today, so if your questions don't get answered, I will follow up with the speakers afterwards and email you with the answer. All right, so Iowa Clean Cities is part of a national network of coalitions that are working to advance the energy, economic, and environmental security of the United States by supporting local decisions to adopt alternative fuels, advanced vehicle technologies, and energy-efficient transportation strategies. Iowa Clean Cities is housed in the Energy Office of the Iowa Economic Development Authority. To help medium and heavy-duty fleets make the transition to alternative fuels more manageable and safe while avoiding mistakes that can occur in the absence of guidance, we've developed this guide that you can see on the left, the Alternative Fuel Vehicle Readiness Guide for Medium and Heavy-Duty Fleets. The guide covers topics to consider and checklists to review when taking on alternative fuel projects. If you are interested, you can find the guide on IDEA's website or at the link provided on the bottom of the slide. We will now transition to Stu Anderson with the Iowa DOT to tell you about the Volkswagen settlement. Stu, you are unmuted.
Very good. Thanks, MK, and thanks everybody for participating in this webinar. So we'll spend the first half hour talking about this first round of funding for the Volkswagen settlement. So I'm Stu Anderson with the Planning Program Modal Division, and Zach Bidding is the program manager here at the DOT and the Office of Systems Planning for administering these VW funds. And Deb Arp, the grant team leader in the Office of Systems Planning, is also here with us. Let's go to the next slide, MK. What we'll do today is provide a real brief overview of the settlement. I think most of you are familiar with that, and then spend the bulk of the time with Zach walking through the program and application overview. If you go to the next slide, MK. On the next slide, we get into more detail about what we'll cover. As I said, I'll just spend a couple minutes on the overview, and then Zach will get into the funding, project eligibility, eligible and ineligible costs, walk through the application, how we'll evaluate projects, and then the schedule. And then again, we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. Next slide. So I think we're all familiar with the Volkswagen settlement through a couple different settlements. Volkswagen is allocating funds to different areas. One of them is the allocation of $2.9 billion of their funds to the Environmental Mitigation Trust. Iowa's allocation of that is a little over $21 million. The state of Iowa intends to utilize that money, obviously and primarily to positively impact air quality by reducing NOx, but also to enhance ability to move goods through competitive transportation options, and also to incentivize alternative modes of transportation in the state of Iowa. Next slide. The Iowa DOT has been designated by the governor to be the lead agency for the administration of these VW funds, but we're working extremely closely with a working group of other state agencies that are listed on this slide. We've been working together throughout every step of the settlement process, and we'll continue to do that as we allocate funds to specific projects in the future. The key dates are listed at the bottom. It's taken a while to get to this point. We had settlements lodged with the court back in 2016. We did some initial survey work from the public to get some feedback on how funds ought to be utilized in Iowa back in the spring of 17. The key date in all of this process was the trust effective date, which was October 2nd of 2017, which allowed beneficiaries to formally request designation, which the state of Iowa did, and received that designation in January of 18, which allowed us to begin work on the mitigation plan, which identifies how we intend to utilize these funds from a high level. There was another round of public input through that process back in May of this year. And then based on that feedback and working group discussions, we submitted the plan in August of 2018, so just a few months ago. Next slide. So the mitigation plan overview, as I mentioned, summarizes how the state intends to utilize those settlement funds. Through the input, we definitely heard from a couple different areas. One, we heard a lot of interest for school bus replacement, specifically for replacing school buses with buses that utilize fuel sources like propane. Also heard a lot of support for zero emission vehicle infrastructure for light duty electric vehicles, and also to supplement with the Diesel Emission Reduction Act grant program. That's a grant program of EPA funds that until a few years ago was administered by Iowa DNR, but now Iowa DOT administers that. And Zach also is the program manager for that program. They're very similar programs, and the settlement allows allocating some of the VW funds to that, and also allows for some additional allocations of funds from EPA. So it's kind of a win-win to utilize funds for that effort as well. In terms of funding cycles, the settlement allows 1/3 of the allocation to be made available in the first year, and then another third allocated in the second year, and then the remaining third is allocated after that. So we're anticipating 3 funding cycles at this point. We've listed the allocations, and Zach will get into more detail on this breakdown, but $4.9 million in each of 3 funding cycles for the categories listed there: buses, for freight and port drayage trucks, and then non-road transport and equipment. $1 million per funding cycle for the zero emission vehicle supply equipment. That's the maximum allowed by the trust. The trust allows 15% of your funds to be utilized for that category. And then $315,000 per year to supplement the diesel exhaust funding we receive from EPA. Before I pass it on to Zach, I just want to close that with the statement that obviously this is the first round. We know we're going to learn a lot as we go through this round. So we're eager and anxious to get feedback through each step of this process, so the working group can digest that, and certainly we can make modifications in future rounds based on lessons learned. So keep that in mind as we all work our way through this first round. Zach?
Next slide, MK. So the first funding cycle will distribute $4.9 million across 3 project categories. The table on the slide lists the available funding amount for each category during this cycle. Also to note, a solicitation of applications for the first funding cycle of the zero emission vehicle supply equipment category is anticipated in 2019. A total of $1,050,000 will be available. Next slide. In this first funding cycle, eligible applicants for this program are private organizations, public transit system operators, cities, counties, and schools that own and operate diesel fleets and equipment in Iowa. State agencies or their employees are not eligible applicants for this program, with the exception that state agencies serving as public transit system operators are eligible applicants for Category 1 projects. Ineligible applicants also include entities or individuals that are currently suspended or debarred by the federal government. Next slide. No applicant will be awarded more than $500,000 in program funds during this funding cycle. An application may include a request for more than one vehicle replacement or repower within the same project category. If an applicant desires to apply for funding across more than one project category, an application must be submitted for each project category. Awards will be made on a cost reimbursement basis, meaning that applicants must incur the cost of the project prior to being repaid. Costs must be incurred only after a project is selected for award and a project funding agreement has been executed with the Iowa DOT. Next slide. Category 1, Class 4 through 8 school bus, shuttle bus, or transit bus includes replacing or repowering a 2009 engine model year or older diesel bus with a new diesel, alternate fueled, or all-electric bus or engine with an engine model year of the current year or one engine model year prior. The conversion of a new vehicle to an alternate fueled vehicle is an eligible replacement project if the conversion is completed by the dealer or manufacturer prior to the applicant receiving the certificate of title for that vehicle. Projects selected for funding will be reimbursed up to the maximum dollar amount per vehicle or the percentage of total cost per vehicle, whichever is less. Total reimbursements will not exceed the total amount awarded to the project. If charging infrastructure is required in conjunction with an all-electric replacement or repower, the applicant may receive up to $10,000 per vehicle toward those costs. Next slide. Category 2, freight trucks and port drayage trucks, includes replacing or repowering 1992 to 2009 engine model year Class 4 through 8 local freight trucks or Class 8 drayage trucks with a new diesel, alternate fueled, or all-electric truck or engine with an engine model year of the current year or one engine model year prior. The conversion of a new vehicle to an alternate fueled vehicle is an eligible replacement project if the conversion is completed by the dealer or manufacturer prior to the applicant receiving the certificate of title for that vehicle. Projects selected for funding will also be reimbursed up to the maximum dollar amount per vehicle or percentage of total cost per vehicle shown in the table. Total reimbursements will not exceed the total amount awarded to the project. If charging infrastructure is required in conjunction with an all-electric replacement or repower, the applicant may receive up to $10,000 per vehicle toward those costs. Next slide. Category 3, non-road transport and equipment replacement or repower projects selected for funding will be eligible to receive on a per application basis up to $300,000 or the percentage of total costs shown in the table, whichever is less. Total reimbursements will not exceed the total amount awarded to the project. If charging infrastructure is required in conjunction with an all-electric replacement or repower, these costs may be included in the application and will be eligible for reimbursement. Next slide. Category 3 includes the following non-road project types. Freight switchers, replacement or repowering of a pre-Tier 4 locomotive that operates 1,000 hours or more per year in rail yards for light freight duties, and rail car transfer with any new diesel, alternate fuel, or all-electric engine or freight switcher is an eligible project under this category. Replacements and repowers need to be certified to meet the applicable EPA emission standards as published in the Code of Federal Regulations for the engine model year in which the replacement or repower occurs. Ferries and tugs with unregulated Tier 1 or Tier 2 diesel-powered marine engines may be repowered with any new Tier 3 or Tier 4 diesel, alternate fueled, or all-electric engines. They may also be upgraded with an EPA certified remanufacturer system or an EPA verified engine upgrade. Marine vessel shore power project type includes systems that enable the main and auxiliary engines of a compatible vessel to remain off while the vessel is at berth. Components eligible for reimbursement are limited to cables, cable management systems, shore power coupler systems, distribution control systems, and power distribution. Marine shore power systems must comply with international shore power design standards and should be supplied with power sourced from the local utility grid. Next slide. Airport ground support equipment eligible for replacement or repower includes Tier 0, Tier 1, or Tier 2 diesel-powered equipment and uncertified or certified spark ignition engine-powered airport ground equipment. Eligible equipment may be repowered with an all-electric engine or may be replaced with an all-electric form of the same airport ground support equipment. Forklifts with a lift capacity greater than 8,000 pounds and port cargo handling equipment may be repowered with an all-electric engine or may be replaced with the same equipment in an all-electric form. Eligible types of forklifts include reach stackers, side loaders, and top loaders. Port cargo handling equipment may be repowered with an all-electric engine or may be replaced with the same equipment in an all-electric form. Port cargo handling equipment shall mean rubber-tired gantry cranes, straddle carriers, shuttle carriers, and terminal tractors, including yard hostlers and yard tractors. Next slide. The following are not eligible activities under this program: vehicle and equipment replacements that are mandated under federal law, liquid or gaseous fueling infrastructure, purchases to expand the fleet, upgrading or replacing diesel vehicles or equipment with gasoline-powered engines, emissions testing, air monitoring, or research activities, replacement or repowers of vehicles or equipment that have been chiefly operated within the state of Iowa during the previous calendar year, replacement or repowers of non-diesel engines, and finally, replacement or repowers of vehicles and equipment that are not owned by the applicant. Next slide, please. Costs directly incurred by the applicant through the purchase and/or installation of eligible technologies, equipment, and vehicles after the execution of a project funding agreement are eligible for reimbursement. These costs may include the procurement of goods and services from vendors and contractors, as well as the labor costs incurred by the applicant's employees for installation. All costs must be supported by appropriate documentation. The Iowa DOT retains the sole authority to determine eligible project costs. Funds awarded by this program cannot be used for administrative costs, lobbying, or for the intervention in federal regulatory proceedings. Costs incurred prior to the execution of the project funding agreement are also ineligible project costs and will not be reimbursed. Next slide, please. Mitigation projects will be evaluated on a competitive basis according to the scoring criteria. While the scoring criteria provided on this page are the primary means of determining a selected project, the Iowa DOT may consider other factors not included in these scoring criteria in making the final selection of projects. Please refer to the funding guidelines for more detailed information on each criterion. In short, the project will be evaluated on reductions of nitrogen oxides emissions, the project's cost effectiveness, the project's disproportionate share of air pollution as it relates to mobile NOx measurements, registered non-compliant Volkswagen vehicles, areas of concern for vulnerable populations, human health, and point source NOx measurements. A project will also be evaluated on previous successful emission reduction projects, verified additional funding sources, the ability to continue such mitigation efforts, and its alignment with the Iowa Energy Plan. Next slide, please. Applicants may submit more than one application. However, no applicant may request funds for more than one NOx reduction category. To apply, please submit the following materials: an application form, a signed certification, fleet description form, project cost form, and a minority impact statement. Complete applications are due by email before 5:00 p.m. Central Standard Time on January 18th, 2019. Applications received after the deadline will be deemed ineligible and will not be reviewed. Incomplete applications may be disqualified from consideration. The Iowa DOT is not responsible for any errors or delays caused by technical difficulties resulting from the emailing of applications. Please submit the completed application packet to vwsettlement@iowadot.us. Next slide, please. The following is the schedule for the first funding cycle. Applications will be due January 18th, 2019. Iowa DOT staff and working group members will review and score applications during the month of February. It is anticipated during March that projects will be awarded and funding agreements will be executed. Lastly, it is anticipated that awarded projects may begin their projects sometime in the month of April 2019. All projects must be completed within 2 years of an executed funding agreement. Next slide, please. Questions on the application or requests for clarification about this program may be submitted in writing via email to vwsettlement@iodot.us. A list of written questions and answers will also be available for review on the Frequently Asked Questions webpage. For more information about the program, please visit the webpage address listed on the screen. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So we now have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. You can put them in the chat box and I will be asking them. So the first question is, can consortiums of school apply as a group? So for an example, can 5 rural schools apply together with one application?
That's complicated right now. I think that is something that we will have to discuss with the working group, and we will find out an answer and provide that question and answer on our Frequently Asked Questions webpage. I think it is very important to consider that.
Yeah, the challenge with that is some of the project evaluation is a little bit location based, so I think it would depend on kind of their proximity to each other, and so yeah, that's something we haven't considered. So we'll think about that, and as Zach said, put the answer on the website.
Okay. The next question is, it's a 2-part question, both related to school buses. So the first part is, do the buses need to have been driven a certain number of miles in the past year?
I believe that it's the funding guidelines, and I'm not certain, but I believe the funding guidelines say that the vehicle must be driven within 80% of the mileage or the hours within the last applicable year.
Within the state of
Within
Iowa.
the state of Iowa.
Okay. And then if a school has already ordered a bus, can the funds still be used, or must they wait until they get the funds to order the bus?
If the school is already under contract for ordering buses, they may not apply for this round for those buses that they have ordered.
Okay. The next question is, would sales tax be included on the invoice sales tax included on the invoice, is it considered an eligible cost?
Yes.
Perfect. Are third-party school bus providers eligible to apply?
Certainly, if they were to meet all the eligible items of an eligible bus to be replaced, and if they were purchasing a new bus that it was equivalent to it. So if they can meet the eligible requirements of the program, then yes, they would be eligible.
Okay. The next question is, what is the sign certification required with the application?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. What is the sign certification required with the application? This was asked by Mike Bima. Mike, can you clarify that a little bit? It's just listed on my.
So the certification is just a form that is signed by an official authorized with that organization that is representing the applying organization, saying that they are supportive of the application and that they will, there's other details within that signed certification, but we will need that in order to proceed with funding any projects.
Okay. The next question is, does the purchase of a CNG semi-tractor apply to this funding?
Without more details, I cannot answer that question. With more details, I would be able to look at the particular project category. I would encourage you to go to the funding guidelines and look up the specific category and see if the replacement vehicle meets the eligible requirements as well as the new vehicle.
Okay. Thank you. The next question is, do fuel system modifications qualify if no engine replacement is necessary? This would be for freight trucks in category 2.
Would you repeat the question again?
Yep. Do fuel system modifications qualify for funding if no engine replacement is necessary?
I think I would need more information on that, but the intent of the program is to replace a vehicle or to replace an engine. So I do not believe that there will be any modifications allowed within this program.
Thank you. The next question is, if we have a diesel transit bus that is 2006 model year, but had the engine replaced in 2015, would it qualify for the grant?
No. And the reason is because the engine model year is newer than 2009.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, how is the state of Iowa going to ascertain the 80% mileage requirement is being met?
The applicant will be signing the certification, and we will assume that in signing the certification that you are telling us the truth.
That may be subject to an audit.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just reading this. Okay. As a school, we have already gone through a bus bid and have just received board approval to purchase our buses, but have not placed an order to buy yet. When should we place the order to be considered for funding in the first round?
Well, while I cannot guarantee that you will receive funding for your particular project, with the current schedule, project funding agreements would be sometime around March. So you would have to hold off until March of 2019. And that would be assuming that you would be receiving funding for those buses.
Thank you. Are manufacturers of commercial motor vehicles eligible to participate in a request for funding support, or is it for purchasers of CMVS? Commercial motor vehicles.
So it would just be the owners of the vehicles that can apply, it wouldn't be the manufacturers.
Thank you. The next question is, when you get rid of the old truck, where does the old truck go?
So old trucks and old engines, they must be scrapped. There's more language within the funding guidelines on details of scrapping vehicles. If you're replacing an engine, you have to drill a certain number of holes within the engine block, and then if you're replacing a vehicle, you must do the same with the engine block as well as cut the chassis. But there are more details about the scrappage requirements within the funding guidelines.
Thank you. And then the next question is, in the second round of funding, do you anticipate the model year for buses to go up to 2010?
At this moment, we do not know when our second funding round will be. It may be later that the year may actually increase beyond 2010 when we have the second funding round. But so at this point, I cannot say.
We think I think those years are defined in the trust agreement, so it's likely it wouldn't change, but certainly if, I guess, the trust settlement terms change, but that all would be provided, as Zach said, when we do the solicitation for the second round.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is going back to the school bus mileage. The question is, does the bus that is going to be replaced need to have been used in a certain amount of the year prior? In other words, can a spare bus be part of this?
Yeah, yes, as long as it was owned by the applicant.
That's correct. The difference between this program and DEER is that in DEER, for the Diesel Emission Reductions Act, if the bus was only operated for certain functions, the replacement vehicle would also have to adhere to those those functions. This program is a replacement of a vehicle with another vehicle. The replacement vehicle has to operate over 80% of the miles or hours within the state of Iowa. I guess we would anticipate that the new replacement vehicle would probably also operate within Iowa as well.
Okay, thank you. And the last question is, do you get the scrap value for the old truck that is scrapped?
I'm not quite sure about that. I'd have to look in the consent decree to see if there's any language regarding whether or not a school district or whomever would be able to obtain the value of the scrappage material, or if it will just go to the scrapyard.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
We'll double check on that question and provide an answer.
Okay, thank you so much. So that wraps up our first question and answer session. We will now move on to Kay Kelly and John Gonzalez of the National Renewable Energy Lab. Thank you so much to DOT, and thank you for all of your questions.
Thanks, MK. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
All right. So NREL has been providing technical assistance to fleets, and Clean Cities coalitions have also been helping their stakeholders formulate projects and submit applications for funding opportunities similar to this Volkswagen opportunity. And we've been doing this for more than 25 years, so we've learned a lot of things along the way. So in our presentation, we're going to cover some of the vehicle, station, and vendor-specific lessons learned that you can use to create a successful project that can take advantage of this Volkswagen funding opportunity. So many of the lessons and some good general guidance are covered in a recent DOE report. Next slide. What fleets need to know about alternative fuel vehicle conversions, retrofits, and repowers. So I'm going to refer to this handbook frequently throughout the presentation. And to conclude, I'll give you some technical assistance options that are at your disposal if you run into any bumps along the way with your project. Next slide. So let's briefly take a look at the opportunity created by the Volkswagen funding. Next slide. So Stu and Zach already outlined the funds available and the plan for the state of Iowa. So really all I want to say here is just because there's funding and just because there are 100 fleets on this phone call right now interested in getting that money doesn't necessarily mean that these efforts are going to be successful. Next slide. We've heard time and again that Clean Cities coalitions are really key to successful alternative fuel projects. They know the people, they know the fleets, they know the vehicles, they know the technologies, and they really know how to arrange these individual pieces in a way that leads to success. And I think we've learned over the years that despite the best laid plans, things can still go wrong. And they also have an arsenal of resources that can come to the rescue and help get projects back on track if you do run into problems. So we want you to leverage the decades of experience and lessons learned from Clean Cities to your advantage. So again, our presentation is going to review a lot of the facets that we know are necessary for a successful project. Next slide. And here is a map of all the Clean Cities coalitions in the U.S. for reference, but of course, MK Anderson, who's today's webinar host, leads the Iowa Clean Cities Coalition, and she is your go-to person for Iowa. Next slide. Before we get too deep on the details, I'm going to hand the podium over to John, and he's going to define a few terms so that everyone's on the same page.
Thanks, Kay. Next slide, please. And like Kay mentioned, I'm going to be kind of going over just some terminology. And the first one is, what is an OEM? Considered an original equipment manufacturer. Really describes the manufacturer of the vehicle, Ford, Chevrolet, things like that. And not to be confused with a system kit manufacturer that puts a fuel system on the vehicle from a conversion standpoint, which would be, on the next slide, what is a conversion? A process, this is considered a process of converting an existing engine, one that's been modified to an alternative power source like natural gas or propane. 85 is an option as well, although there are not many certified systems out there, or to hybrid power. There's a couple different ways you can do it. You can either do a dedicated, which means monofuel to single fuel, or a bifuel, which has the ability to run on either the alternative fuel or to the gasoline traditionally. And then you have a dual fuel, which has the ability to run traditionally a spark ignited is your dedicated and biofuel, and a dual fuel uses the diesel fuel as the ignition source to get natural gas or propane to burn, or you can also do a hybrid. We also want to make sure that people are looking at the current codes and standards, NFPA 52 for natural gas, 58 for propane. CSA is another guiding document that has different standards in there for how these conversions should be done, and make sure you're working with people that are following these conversion standards. Then finally, what is a retrofit? A retrofit is traditionally when you take a diesel engine and you put, in this picture here, a diesel particulate filter. Those filters are designed to remove hydrocarbons. It's an add-on device that can help you reduce emissions, but still is not what a conversion, or still not what an OEM would use in conjunction with a factory-based engine. And I apologize. Now, finally, we have what is a repower, which is slide 11. If you could, MK, go to the next one. What is a repower? It's traditionally taking an older vehicle and replacing it with an engine or powertrain like electric with some type of a certified system, traditionally being in the case maybe repowering it with a natural gas engine that traditionally had a diesel engine in its place. So there are many benefits to this, but there's also many complications. And the biggest challenge you want to make sure is, if you do go down this path, make sure you're using an engineered design system for this, because they will help try to engineer through those complications that you can run into.
All right, next slide. So thanks, John. Now we're going to take a look at some of the vehicle considerations based on lessons learned over the years. And again, looking towards you guys creating some successful projects. So next slide. The first step in converting, retrofitting, or repowering a vehicle is to fully understand the attributes of the existing vehicle, the job that vehicle is required to perform day in and day out, and how the fuel or technology that you're considering is going to impact the operation and performance of that vehicle. Fleets depend on their vehicles to go out every day, perform a job, so successful projects definitely have to take into account the job that those vehicles have to do in order to ensure that they can continue performing that job. So John, next slide is yours.
You bet, thank you. Some of the vehicle considerations that Kay was mentioning is the fuel properties. One thing we like to talk about is combustion temperatures. Natural gas and propane, if you're looking at that, is going to be different than we're used to with gasoline and diesel. So if you're looking in towards a conversion system, you want to make sure that the engines are prep ready. The engines are then designed for these higher temperature fuels, and also these fuels have a lower lubricity characteristic than you're used to with gasoline and diesel. So make sure that you're looking into that and make sure the engines are prep ready to do that with. And then start looking at your driving distance, terrain, traffic, vehicle loading. What are all these effects going to be on how that vehicle is going to be operated on a daily basis? Look at fuel density. Look at station availability, station proximity to routes. Natural gas is a gas. It is stored as gas, so you're not going to be able to get as much fuel on as you're used to with gasoline and diesel. Make sure that your fuel storage is adequate for what that vehicle needs on a daily basis. Also, propane is a fuel that's sold on a gallon basis. It doesn't have quite as much energy as we're used to with gasoline. So make sure that you're, when you look at these buses, and I tell people time and time again, if you're going to buy a school bus that's propane, buy the one that has the largest tank package you can. That way you can put them on routes that are longer routes if you need to, and you're not worried about it. The second thing is driver anxiety. They can get concerned if that fuel gauge moves different than they're used to with gasoline or diesel. The largest tanks will help minimize that range anxiety that drivers can get. The next piece is, next page please, MK, is weight consideration. Natural gas tanks, propane tanks, they have a different weight than we're used to with gasoline and diesel. Make sure you're placing them in the right place. Make sure that there's an OEM design system doing this, because if you place them in the wrong locations, they can alter the way the vehicle operates. And chassis strength is critical to make sure that you're looking at that as well. Can they support these fuel tanks that you're putting on there? Is there enough space for the fuel lines? What does the engine compartment look like? Is there room to put the equipment that you need in there? And then also body and chassis. What kind of body will go on this vehicle? Will the chassis support that body? Can you work with the manufacturer that sometimes they can put a smaller box in a pickup that will allow for a natural gas or a propane tank, and it doesn't affect any of the cargo space? So kind of work with your suppliers on that and your manufacturers, because they can help you with those. And then the next slide is really the kind of the meat and potatoes of the final ending of it. Where can you fuel? It's going to be important to know where you're fueling. Do you have on-site fueling? Do you have to go off-site? Is it going to be convenient? Do they have to go outside their route to do that? Or is it going to be convenient where they can go within their route? Obviously, with schools, you don't want to fill with students on board, so you need to make sure all that stuff is working well. And then also, how are the vehicles going to be available? And serviceability of those vehicles, training of your technicians, facilities, how do you deal with your facilities and modifications? We're going to get into that here in a little bit, but also understand these vehicles are different. So out of service time can change because technicians sometimes at dealerships aren't always friendly to this. Work with your local dealerships, make sure they're on board, make sure they're willing to be there to support you in these vehicles. Just because they're different doesn't mean they're not going to be hard to work on, because in most cases they're easier, but they are different. So work with your local dealer to make sure that they have the service and support for you. Okay.
All right. So next topic we'll move into is stations and vendors. So next slide. So many of you might be scratching your heads and saying, I didn't know Volkswagen funding paid for fueling station. Well, it doesn't. It only pays for EV charging, and then only if the state opts to use that option. But really, fueling experience is critical because it can make or break an alternative fuel vehicle project. So we do want to mention a few other lessons learned on this topic. So next slide. Station locations are very, very important. Understand where the fleets are in relation to the available stations. The Department of Energy has a station locator you can use to help find those stations. And also think about whether these stations are on their typical driving routes. The driver experience matters, and requiring drivers to go miles out of their way to fuel can negatively impact their impressions of the vehicle. And for stations that are intended to connect corridors, you also have to think about driving distances carefully. For example, if you have an EV with an advertised range of 100 miles, it might not be able to go that full 100 miles if that drive is uphill, or if it's running the air conditioning full blast. So think about those things and give yourself a little bit of a buffer. Station capacity is also important. Be cognizant of fill times or dwell time in the case of an electric vehicle, because it can take a while to refuel a CNG or an LNG tractor. It can also take a while to recharge an EV, even if you're at a DC fast charging station. Think about the station throughput, especially for fuels like CNG. If a station doesn't have enough storage and compression, a CNG delivery truck that pulls in behind a school bus that is just filled up is going to have to wait a long time for enough fuel to get into the system for them to be able to fill up as well. So again, even though VW funds aren't going toward the CNG or propane stations, the fleet's experience with the infrastructure is going to impact the success of your project. Next slide. So let's move on to finding and selecting vendors. Most municipalities have standard bid documents, but these may not sufficiently cover all the moving pieces that are present in conversion, retrofit, and repower projects. So we've listed a few of those best practices here. Make sure that your vendor bid documents address the requirement that installations are performed according to manufacturer guidelines, accepted industry practices, national codes and standards, and any particular local or state requirements. It's also good to include an evaluation period. This might be requiring a certain number of vehicles to be converted, then taking a break so that your personnel can conduct independent testing and inspection before proceeding with the rest of the conversions. Periodic inspections are also a good idea. This provides the opportunity for spot checks to be performed throughout the project and across several waves of conversions, to make sure that the installation quality and adherence to the established procedures happens from the beginning of the project all the way to the end. And finally, getting out to that conversion facility yourself is also a good way to verify any information the vendor provides to you, helps you establish a face-to-face working relationship. You're going to need a partner in these projects, not just a salesman, so really make some visits to their facility and get to know them. Next slide, more on vendors. So alt fuel projects aren't necessarily more risky than traditional projects, but they do tend to involve a lot of small volume manufacturers. And some of these folks can come and go. So there are risks associated with that, but you can mitigate those risks with doing some due diligence. So the first thing is you're going to want to make sure that you ensure the financial and business solvency of any vendors that you're working with. Perform a risk assessment. Ask for copies of their business records, tax returns, bank statements, insurance coverage. Look at the Better Business Bureau. Make sure that they have a business license. Check to see that there aren't any pending lawsuits or bankruptcy or court filings against them. Doing this kind of work can be time-consuming, but it can also provide really good insight into a company's status and steer you towards someone who is a reputable vendor. It's also a good idea to ask for references, ask about the vehicles, ask about customer service, level of responsiveness, and be alert for red flags. If you talk to a different person on the phone every time you call, that can be indicative that they have a lot of turnover and there can be some problems with that vendor. Next slide. It's also important to look at how the vendor manages the work itself. For personnel, really the successful installation of these conversions and retrofits and repowers is highly dependent on the skills, the training, the attentiveness of the person who's doing the work. So always inquire about the training of their technicians. John's going to elaborate that on that a little more. Make sure that installation procedures are written so that they can be followed every single time. Reputable vendors should be able to provide you with those documents and tell you how their technicians follow them. Inventory control seems like a small thing, but it's also really important. Conversion kits include many parts, often very small components, and some of them require special handling. For instance, you can't store a natural gas fuel tank outdoors where it can rust. You can't store it somewhere where it's going to get bumped into by a forklift. And inventory control systems are also really important to keep all these pieces accounted for and in good condition. You don't want technicians pulling pieces from more than one of these kits at a time, because that can leave you with incomplete boxes of parts toward the end of a project. And some of these systems are really sensitive to swapping in a component that didn't come from the same manufacturer. So you want that kit to be complete. And John's going to give some more details on quality assurance in the next slide.
Okay, thanks. You set the table pretty well for several of these next slides. First of all, as the vendors, Kay had mentioned this, we want to ensure that it's done from a quality standpoint and quality the first time. Work with trained technicians. We have a term they call qualified system retrofitter, that is somebody that has different certifications. A lot of times we want to look at the different ASC certifications on the automotive side, but also natural gas has a certification. Start looking for those, and also work with them to find out if they've been certified through their manufacturer, the fuel system that they're working on, or through the OEM. Have they sent their folks through factory training classes? Look into that and do that research. It's important to make sure that you know going in that the partner, what I call a partner, it's not a vendor, it's a partner that you're working with, has these people that are there helping you to support you through this process. Ford has a QVM program. It's really designed for what we would call conversions, but through their own system. They have a whole parts tracking mechanism to this. There's a lot of certification that goes behind that. Ford does a quality job on this, so if you're working with Ford products, look for their QVM program, that you're working with somebody that's doing this. And we have a term here, be cautious. Be aware that there's a lot of people that are going to want to take advantage of the money that's available. Make sure you're working with a quality company that's going to ensure that they're doing the work for you long-term and in a quality manner. Emission certifications are another piece that we want to talk about. There's two different ones out there. One is EPA, the other is CARB. We're going to primarily talk about EPA here. Ensure that the emissions have, they ensure that the emissions have not been increased over the base vehicle, and also the vehicle meets the current model year certification from an emission standpoint. This is very important. Kit manufacturers will obtain these certificates of conformity, which I'll show on the next slide, through EPA. It will show that that certified fuel system is for that engine in particular. Also, CARB has similar certifications. That's the Certificate of Conformity that's now on the screen. Also, ensures that the certificate is for that particular fuel system, whether it would be for the conversion manufacturer for that given engine. Ensure that you're getting these because that guarantees that you are getting a certified conversion for that vehicle itself. You can also look at our resource handbook for more information regarding those pieces of information. And then finally, one more, the ongoing maintenance and support. This kind of keeps going hand in hand with who are you choosing your supplier to be. Make sure that they work directly with the OEM or the kit supplier. Make sure that they are qualified. Look at their wall. See how proud they are of the technicians that they have. Make sure they have certifications, and also if they do have the ability and they're using natural gas, that they are certified on the natural gas side of it as well. Don't be afraid to ask for these. It's going to be important for you long term to make sure that they have them. And also understand what is the equipment that you have. Get a parts list, know where they're at, and go from there.
John, that is your time. Thank you so much. Zach and VOT, I'm going to unmute you as well because I think some of the questions are coming for you. So the first question is, okay, 40-inch transit or 40-foot transit bus manufacturer's delivery time frame is 18 to 24 months from the time of the order. Will there be a leeway if delivery goes beyond the 2-year period for this reason?
I think that'll be a case-by-case basis, and we'll probably cross that bridge when we get there. 18 months is still a year and a half, so we'll with each applicant, there is a possibility that we can look at that, but for right now, we're going to stick with the 2 years and see how it goes.
Thank you. The next question is this funding only for replacing or repowering Volkswagen products?
No, it's not limited to Volkswagen products.
Thank you. The next question is, would a conversion kit be allowable since it doesn't require engine destruction?
I want to say no, because I think the intent of the program is to replace a vehicle or replace or repower vehicle engines. So a conversion would be neither of those.
Thank you. The next question is, in respect to electric vehicles, how is the working group ascertaining if EVs are meeting US DOT safety standards, including federal motor vehicle safety standards needed to operate on public roads?
Who is this addressed to?
You, sorry, Zach, to you.
What was the question again?
How is the working group going to ascertain that the EVs are meeting US DOT safety standards, including the federal motor vehicle safety standards needed to operate on public roads?
Good question. We'll take a look at it and we'll provide an answer on the frequently asked questions webpage.
Thank you. The next question is, will retrofit or conversion of dual or dedicated fuel systems which generate less emissions than diesel qualify for this funding opportunities? Zach, let's do you.
Yeah, that's I don't know right now. I'll have to take a look at the decree as well as our funding guidelines and talk to the working group, and we'll get an answer back.
Zach, this is Stephanie Weisenbach, MK's colleague, and I guess I would ask you and the others to look at the application guidance that relates to scrapping an old vehicle and then purchasing a new vehicle that fits the settlement definition of an alternate fuel vehicle. And your requirement states as long as it was purchased in the title of the recipient, then the manufacturer or dealer could do the conversion retrofit. And then, just at some point in the Q&A, just to more flesh that out, because there is some information in the application that provides that as long as the old vehicle is scrapped, the new alternative fuel vehicle could either be a new OEM or the conversion of a new OEM vehicle.
Okay, the next question is, will the second funding cycle have roughly the same funding available as the first cycle?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you. The next question is, are CARB and EPA certifications required prior to a project being approved in round one?
I think that depends on the category, but I think it wouldn't need to be before the application.
Okay, thank you. That is the end of our questions right now. Does anyone else have any questions that they want to put in the chat? All right, it doesn't look like it. Well, thank you guys so much for attending today's webinar. I will be following up with all of the speakers to make sure we get these questions answered, and we will be sending the webinar recording out to all attendees once we have it ready. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day. Stop.